Welcome everyone to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm really pleased today to be with Aidan Lyon. Aidan reached out to me because he'd seen some of my work, and he's currently working on a book called Psychedelic Experience. I was very privileged. He sent me I think it's a penultimate draft, and we've been having some discussion around this. And so I invited him to a Voice with Vervaeke because I think the material he's working on will be important and relevant and very interesting to many of you because it overlaps with many of the concerns that this community is directed towards. So welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you're trying to do with the book, and then we can get in specifically to what you mean by psychedelic experience.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on. As you mentioned, I saw some of your work with actually I saw your podcast with Jordan Peterson, and you were describing some of the stuff you were working on, and I almost fell off my seat when that happened, because there was such striking similarities between your work and mine. And then over the last week or two, I've been looking at a lot more of your work, and yeah, it's pretty amazing how similar we're thinking, but also we're coming at it from different perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'm a philosopher by training. I have a background in mathematics as well, but really my kind of bread and butter as an academic is being a philosopher. I'm also half-time an academic and half-time an entrepreneur. So I kind of live in two worlds simultaneously. So the company that I co-founded with some other philosophers is called Delphi Club. And that might be something we want to talk about later on, because I know you have an affinity for Delphi and thyself and all things related to that. So the company helps. So really my academic work before I got into psychedelics and meditation was on probability, uncertainty, collective wisdom, decision-making, that sort of stuff. And we created this company to apply a lot of that research in the form of software and consulting to help large organizations to make better decisions and better forecasts of what the future is going to be like. So for example, one of our clients was the Australian government. This is one of the clients I can talk about. And they were interested in getting better probabilistic forecasts of emerging infectious diseases. And so we would apply techniques from psychology and philosophy in the form of software to help them to get better at that sort of task. So that kind of dominated my work for a really long time. And then about 8 years ago, I got interested in the topic of psychedelics. And that quickly got me kind of reinterested in the topic of meditation. And so since then, I've been working on that topic as a philosopher. And little did I know what I thought these were going to be two independent streams of my work. But it turns out they're completely related. And one way of putting it is my more corporate work is about helping people be wise, right? And then my academic work is on psychedelics and meditation. And I think the kind of main gist of my work is these things are really important tools for helping us become wise, better decision makers, more creative.
Yeah, already the convergence is quite significant. So perhaps a good place to start, because there's both a lot of controversy and confusion and equivocation. I should have said one more than both. But there's a lot of confusion and equivocation around the notion of what is meant by psychedelic experience. And you spend quite a bit of time, especially in the introduction to the book, trying to get very clear about how you are specifically understanding psychedelic experience and what you mean by that phrase. So could you just unpack that for us right now? Because I think that's a very good place to really get it. I like Scott Atran's idea that one of the functions of science is to sort of challenge common sense, get us initially away from the familiar, so that we can return to explain it in a new way. So, how would you go about, defining, explaining, describing what you mean by psychedelic experience?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, about 8 years ago, I got into this topic by having these experiences myself, and like a lot of people, they were having a profound impact on me in all sorts of ways that I could spend forever talking about. Yeah. And eventually I realized that I knew these experiences were having a really positive effect on me, but I didn't know what they were. And I was talking to other people using this term psychedelic experience. And eventually I realized I didn't really know what I was talking about when I was saying that. I was kind of referring to these experiences that I was having with these substances, but that I didn't know what content I was conveying when I was using that term. And I noticed when other people were talking, there was I could see there's a lot of crosstalk or miscommunication.
Yep.
When they're using this term. And so this is what philosophers do. Philosophers are great at asking, like, pick a concept and ask, what is it? Like, what is wisdom? What is love? This is what we do.
Right.
And at one point I had this insight, this is a philosophical question. What is psychedelic experience?
Exactly.
What is this thing that's going on? Yeah. So I was reading around about this stuff, and I think at some point I must have come across the kind of original definition of the term psychedelic. It comes from these Greek words, psyche and delos, meaning, well, there's multiple interpretations, but one is mind and reveal or make clear, so mind revealing.
Right.
Another interpretation is soul or spirit for psyche, and manifest for delos, and I think that's an important alternative interpretation that we can come back to in a moment. But mind revelation is, I think, probably the easiest meaning to get started with. And at one point I had an insight, I think by myself, I really don't know what the origin was, when I was thinking about what are these experiences, and I realized, this is your mind being revealed. This is the kind of forces that are usually shaping my conscious experience and my decisions and behavior are sort of coming to the surface. Yes. And that's the kind of key or core feature of these experiences. And of course, other people have had that idea. And go ahead.
I just wanted to say, so does that, like, one of the things you start to make clear is that that's a much more generic reference than people normally realize. So you don't have, what you say is, you're not excluding, but you're also saying you don't have to be taking these substances to have a psychedelic experience. For example, if somebody was doing Jungian active imagination and all kinds of stuff of the unconscious was coming up, that would fall under your definition, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at that definition of the word psychedelic experience as mind revelation, that doesn't have anything to do with substances.
Yeah, right.
It's just a hidden part or aspect or something like that about the mind being revealed. And that could happen in all sorts of ways.
Right.
And then when you look at pretty much any discussion on meditation, for example, that's like an important thread of what they're talking about. When you're meditating, it's not all that there is to meditation, but this is definitely something that happens in meditation.
Right.
And of course, there's just millions of techniques like this: yoga, fasting, breath work, contemplation. There's so many different methods that could create these or lead you to have these experiences. And psychedelics is just one particular way of doing it.
Right.
And something I talk about in the book is that these different methods for having these experiences create these experiences of different kinds. So I think there's different kinds of psychedelic experiences. Yeah. And by understanding those different kinds, we can get a better understanding of how these different methods interact with each other.
Right. So one of the areas I want to see is you explicitly, I think it's in the chapter on attention, and we'll work towards it. You pursue a sort of an integrated, unified theory of mindfulness and psychedelic experience, having sort of a complementary relationship to each other. So maybe that's a good thing to start. So let's move into, and I think you talked about these two pieces, so I think it's relatively clear. You actually are proposing a philosophy of psychedelic experience, an attempt to understand it, bring a conceptual framework, and as you said, integrate various kinds within a unified framework. So let's start to get into that, and the parts that I think might be sort of really foundational is exactly that unified theory of mindfulness and psychedelic experience in terms of attention, selection, salience, prioritization, etc. Is that fair enough as a question for you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, so so as you know, there's a lot of issues in defining what mindfulness is.
Yes,
right?
Very much. Yeah.
It's not easy, and there's a lot of confusion there. So let me say, so I think, so one kind of good approximation to mindfulness that I think is kind of a really useful one to work with. It's not necessarily like an like the kind of all-encompassing definition of mindfulness, but something that kind of gives more meat on the bone than the usual definition of mindfulness. Can be expressed in terms of psychedelic experience, or really its opposite, which I call psychocryptic experience.
Okay.
So if a psychedelic experience is a mind revealing experience,
right,
then the opposite of a mind revealing experience is a mind concealing experience. It's mind being hidden. And I think, following tradition, if you go back and plug in the last point in the cell, that would be a psychocryptic, cryptic coming from kryptos, to conceal, a psychocryptic experience.
Right.
So same idea that we have in like cryptography, for example, you're concealing a message. And so if you can have a psychedelic experience now, that must mean that there's something about your mind right now that's psychocryptic.
Right. Yes.
There must be something that's concealed.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And so here's one first approximation to defining mindfulness. The more mindful you are, the less psychocryptic your current state is.
Right.
The less is concealed. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these things that would normally be concealed in your awareness, but they can be easily drawn into awareness if you wanted to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, and so that's the kind of, as a short version of a short way of defining mindfulness. The other way is in terms of this framework that I have called psychedelic space.
Right.
Do you want me to? It takes a little bit of work to get into this, but do you want me to?
I think it'll be valuable.
Go for it. Okay, sure. So this starts with the idea that so we often talk about experiences being psychedelic or not, as a kind of binary matter. But really they come in degrees. Some experiences are more psychedelic than others, right? And that must mean that some experiences are more revelatory of the mind, more revealing of the mind.
Yes.
Right. And so this is another thing that philosophers do. Once we've got a concept and we've asked our question, we try to analyze it. We try to break it down into components. So what are the ways, how can some experience be more psychedelic than another? How can something be more revealing of the mind? And the way I approach this is thinking about, well, what does it mean to reveal anything? And what does it mean to be more revealing of something? Right. So you could like take this, like the painting behind me. So I can, at the moment, it's like, I don't know, about 50% revealed. Right. And I can reveal more of it by coming back like this. Right. Now, suppose that my, our internet connection was really bad and it was very pixelated. Right. So then even though I did this, you may not be able to see what the painting is.
Right.
Okay. So these are kind of two dimensions of revelation. One is kind of scope, how much of the object is being revealed. And then the other one is clarity, the kind of resolution that it's being revealed. So by increasing these dimensions, create a kind of more of a revelation of the object. And then similarly, like suppose there was something completely covering it behind me, and I just kind of flashed open the painting and enclosed it really quickly. You get a very brief glimpse of it. There's a sense in which I've revealed the full thing to you in full clarity, but in such a short duration that you didn't really get a chance to look at it. So that's the third dimension, is the duration of the experience that you're having. And then the fourth dimension is the novelty. So suppose I have this painting covered, I reveal it, and then I conceal it again, and then now I reveal it again. There's a sense in which that is not as revealing as the first experience when you first got to see the painting. So I call this novelty. So these four dimensions create a kind of conceptual space, which I call psychedelic space, that define the different ways an experience could be more or less revealing.
So I'm wondering about that because, in a positive sense, because that aligns with a sort of growing consensus of the functionality of consciousness. That consciousness is precisely for, ill-defined, complex, novel situations. And that what you need to do is hold it in mind in order to process it well. Those are exactly the 4 dimensions you just laid out for psychedelic experience. So there'd be a deep connection between bringing something into consciousness and opening up the psychedelic space, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So you can apply this framework to any kind of psychedelic experience, mind revealing experience. And I should say something I don't think we covered was that you can have these experiences during normal everyday life.
Yes,
So you don't have to be meditating, you don't have to be doing anything weird. Just, for example, whenever you have a creative insight on some problem that you're working on, that doesn't necessarily, but I think it can count as a psychedelic experience. Or when you remember a long lost memory from your childhood that suddenly pops into your awareness, that can count as a psychedelic experience.
Yeah, and I agree. And let's do the thing of insight. What I was trying to point to with the deep connection between this and consciousness is, the prototypical phenomenology of the insight. It's a flash of insight. There's sort of super salience. People talk about psychedelic experiences somehow in expansion or enrichment of consciousness. I'm just trying to point out that there's this dimension. There's a phenomenological dimension that comes with the psychedelic space.
Yeah, exactly. So you might, let's keep going with the insight idea, the creative idea. So you might get like a fragment of an idea for a film that you want to create, right? You just get David Lynch talks like this. He gets like a few ideas, like red lips and green lawn and a song. It's just these fragments, and then he's got to figure out how they connect to each other, right? So that's a psychedelic experience. It's some idea that's being revealed, but you could have the full film revealed to you in one experience. And people have experiences like this, right? Like an entire novel, a poem, it's just there in your mind right away. And so it could be the same idea revealed in fragments or revealed in its entirety. And this would be a difference in scope.
So no disrespect intended by this comment, but Muhammad's experience of being sort of thrown to the ground by Gabriel and having to recite the Quran would be a very powerful psychedelic experience under your definition.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, to be honest, but if it's the key thing though, so the key thing is that it's got to be there in your mind already. So this is, and I think this is an important thing. So I think psychedelics are not necessarily always revealing the mind. I think they might be having other effects. So something could be created on the fly, and that wouldn't necessarily be a psychedelic experience.
No, I understand that, but so I come from the 4E cognitive science, and where I think of the mind not inside you, but between you and the world. And so what I'm saying is that's how Marlo Ponte, that's how I think of consciousness. So anything mind revealing by bringing into consciousness is also in some sense going to be world revealing for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is so another one. This is I kind of touch on this in 2 chapters on the chapter on attention, the chapter on hallucination.
Right.
So there are all sorts of unconscious perceptions that we're having right now of the world. We're not aware of them because they're unconscious.
Yes. And
in these psychedelic states, or in these kind of more mindful states as well, these perceptions that would normally be kind of outside of our awareness can be in awareness. So there's a sense in which you're having mind revelation. These perceptions are being revealed, but in virtue of that, the world is being revealed.
Yeah.
Right? You're seeing more of the world.
So there's sorry. I just want to, there's a possibility then for kind of like a reciprocal opening, right? You can see people, the world is being disclosed more, the mind, because people often talk that way too, about a kind of resonance with the world when they're in these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's easy to fall into the, I don't want to say trap, but like the habit of talking about these experiences kind of like isolated moments.
Yes.
So a typical psychedelic trip, let's say on psilocybin, is about 5 hours. Yeah. And so we normally think of that's the thing, but really that experience will have some effect on long-term behavior.
Yes.
And the person will start changing their environment.
Yes.
Right. And then they'll have another trip later on, and this new environment is going to affect their trip. And you can get this, you get a transformation in one single experience, but you also get this series of experiences and interaction with the environment that can completely change your life.
So let's get a little bit more then into that integrated theory. So, of mindfulness and psychedelic. Because you talk about mindfulness, about the control of attention and the psychedelic experience, the psychedelic space opening up, providing more resources, attentional resources for allocation, if I understand correctly. And so maybe, briefly talk about, because you and I share very similar views. I think they're sort of emerging consensus views around the nature of attention. And then maybe use that to talk about this complementary relationship, because I think it's a really great idea between, mindfulness relationship to attention, psychedelic relationship to attention, and therefore why they kind of need each other, at least, or afford each other.
Yeah. So this was one of these. I stumbled into this idea as I was working on the book. I didn't kind of set out with this intention. It's just as I was kind of connecting the dots, I got this literally a triangle that connects dots.
Yeah.
So one point is meditation, one point is psychedelics, and one point is awareness.
Right.
So we have this idea that psychedelics expand awareness, expand a consciousness.
Yeah.
And we have the idea that meditation does this as well.
Right. Yes.
And there's an idea that psychedelics and meditation having similar effects, but they're clearly also different. So there's some relationship between them.
Yes.
And then in the middle of the triangle is attention, because we know attention has like an extraordinarily crucial effect on awareness, right? Attention is, roughly speaking, deciding what appears in awareness, but it's also affecting the character of your awareness.
Yes.
Okay, so we know that meditation is having this effect on awareness. We also know that meditation is having this effect on attention, and we know attention has an effect on awareness.
Yes.
So that bit of the kind of triangle makes sense. And we know psychedelics are having this effect on awareness, and we know psychedelics are doing something similar to meditation. How are they having the effect on awareness? And the hypothesis that I float in the book is that they're having it via some effect on attention.
Yeah.
And so attention is kind of like you could think of it as a unifying ingredient for understanding how these kind of interventions are affecting awareness.
Right. I see.
And so the puzzle then is, okay, so it seems quite plausible that, well, at least on this kind of symmetry and a lot of the other things we know, the psychedelics are having an effect on awareness via some effect on attention. Right. The question then, of course, is what is that effect on attention? Right. Because it's clearly not the same effect as meditation is having on attention.
This is a very good argument. Very good argument.
Yeah. So I'm not settled on any particular view, because I think the neurological evidence is still coming in. Like, there's still a lot of work to do to know for sure. But I think a plausible view is that, I'm trying to figure out which is the best way to approach this. Psychedelics. So okay, I'll just say the view, and then I'll backtrack a little bit. I think a plausible view is that psychedelics are disrupting the usual kind of habits of kind of allocating attentional resource.
Yeah, very much. Kind of frame breaking.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So with meditation, there's different practices of meditation, but two in particular that I talk a lot about in the book is focused attention meditation and open monitoring meditation. And in terms of the instructions, they're both clearly about attention. One is about focusing attention on some objects, such as your breath. And the other is, I guess it's less transparently about attention. It's more about kind of observing your thoughts and sensations and not reacting to them. But the effect that it has is it distributes your attention. And we know from the scientific investigation of these meditative techniques that they have observable effects on attention.
Yep.
And downstream observable effects on awareness. So one way of kind of summarizing those results is that meditation is having an improvement in the kind of efficiency and control over how we allocate our attentional resources. I think what psychedelics are doing is it's not improving the control over our attention. There's not much work on this, but the evidence that we do have is that psychedelics disrupt our ability to disrupt our performance on attentional tasks. But I think what they're doing is they're breaking up our usual habits of attention so that we have a kind of a surplus of attention that can flow onto anything and in a somewhat random, chaotic way depending on the kind of psyche of the individual and the environment that they're in. So one way of kind of fleshing this out, it's not the only way, is that as we go about our daily lives, a lot of our attention is consumed by like kind of egocentric kind of stuff. So like the fight that we had in the past, or anxiety about finances, or what have you, right? There's a lot of kind of mental chatter that's consuming our attentional resources. And the thought is that this is not the only way it can happen, but the thought is psychedelics can knock that stuff out.
Yeah.
And when it does, you have this surplus of attention that you would normally be spending on that stuff that can now be spent on something else.
So this is like, Parhart Harris's idea. You're sort of, knocking out the automatic prioritization that the default mode network has, all that self-centered kind of cognitive framing of the world. And then that opens up, right? As you said, it opens up attentional resources to raise the salience of things that are normally not as salient for us.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be so closely tied to the ego or these sorts of more kind of personal worries. It could also be like our habits for looking at the world that can get disrupted. And then so we have more kind of free-flowing attentional resource in our visual field, which is why like the vision seems expanded and things seem more colorful and more detailed.
Exactly. And so in that sense, it starts to overlap also with things like the flow experience, where people feel resonance, this connection, the sort of insight cascade, the super salience, and they start to also get a diminishment of that sort of self-conscious reflection. And then and then of course farther along, I would argue a continuum. There's full-blown mystical experience where the sense of self is radically diminished.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, a mystical experience as a whole, we could talk about that one forever. That's I think one kind of like, let's just say like a very rough way of characterizing them is like they're kind of extreme psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And so so this is important. So on that kind of conceptual space, the psychedelic space framework that I was talking about, where you got scope, clarity, duration, and novelty.
Right.
It's you're getting a kind of a maximization of all four dimensions simultaneously.
Yeah.
And the more you get a higher score on those dimensions, the more you're having a mystical experience.
I think that's a really good conceptual framework for trying to explicate the dimensionality of that kind of continuum we've been talking about. But please continue. So it sounds like therefore there is kind of a complement. Like you can have control, but if you don't have a lot of extra resources, you can't do much with it. If you have extra resources and you can't control them, like you're also not going to do much with it. But if you can integrate the two together, that's presumably going to have a synergistic improvement effect.
Yeah, exactly. So one analogy I like is attention is like money, and if you're not good at managing your money and you suddenly get a lot of it, it might be fun for a bit, but it's not going to solve your problems long term, right? And so attention is kind of helping us better manage our attention, and psychedelics kind of like break it up and like we get a lot more of it very, very quickly. And I think this explains why we see these interesting synergies between meditation and psychedelics.
Yes, I think that's right. So,
right.
I also, now you didn't talk about this as much in the book, but this what I think converges with what you're saying. I also pose that one of the benefits of that improved control is an improved capacity for self-correction. So there's evidence that mindfulness enhances insight, and the same machinery that enhances insight also enhances the capacity to deal with self-deception. And therefore, one of the more longitudinal benefits of an extended mindfulness practice, or I would argue an ecology of practices, is it can reduce the way psychedelics can open you up to, bullshitting yourself in very powerful ways. And so that control can also have an aspect of self-correction, self-protection against, because disruptive strategies are bivalent. They can go in bad directions. And so do you think that sits well with what your theory is too?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the kind of the stereotypical psychedelic trip is one that might kind of reveal a lot of novel content that's
Yeah.
large in character, but very low in clarity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the kind of scene that you get in like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a hallucinatory mess, and there's probably real content underlying that, but it's such a mess that you're not understanding any of it. And maybe even worse than that are these cases of confabulation.
Yes.
Where so some content is revealed. It's like truly there, but you misinterpret it in some way because there's still a lot of like habitual thinking in response to that. So it could be I don't know, like so suppose you're
what about content that comes up that's associated with trauma of some kind?
Yeah, exactly.
People confabulating as they do in the face of trauma in order to try and deal with that.
Yeah, exactly. So something may come up that's real, but it gets interpreted through a distorted lens.
Yeah.
And then that can end up having a negative effect on someone's life.
Yes.
Right. Because they might take action on that insight. And then, obviously it's not going to align with reality. So I think there's different ways of kind of mitigating that risk. So it's obviously not, this is definitely going to be the case. I think probably on average, the tendency is more towards enough clarity to get an insight that's actionable in a positive way. But there's still that risk, and I think there's some measures we can take to mitigate it. One is practicing mindfulness, getting better at understanding how your mind is working and kind of controlling it and having that kind of psychological flexibility.
Another is your book. We should also, bring philosophical reflection to bear on the phenomena as well.
Well, so to be honest, that's why I wrote the book. So I wrote the book primarily for my former self, because I was having these experiences, and I knew that, like, so some of them were clearly very valuable. They were like leading to dramatic improvements in my life, but others were not. The insights were like less obviously beneficial, let's say. And I realized that like this, it's not, you can't just have these because they come through with such certainty. That's the thing. They're kind of extra misleading.
Yes.
Right? You get an insight, but it's with such a high level of confidence, way higher than your normal levels of insight.
Exactly.
And so these need to be embedded in some kind of analytical framework so they can be kept in check. And beautiful. Kind of triangulated with everything else going on in your life.
Excellent. Yeah, I sometimes put it is we've got to find a way to sail between the Scylla and Charybdis of deifying or demonizing these experiences, right? And I think a proper job of philosophical reflection is to do just that. So this then, I think we're now right on the cusp of the next thing that I want to talk to you about, which is we then go from a philosophy of psychedelic experience into psychedelic philosophy, which is, but you like not what does philosophy have to say about psychedelics, but what can psychedelics do to help the practice of philosophy, which specifically understood as a cultivation of wisdom. And I really enjoyed that. I thought that that maps up with so much of the work, you see in, Pierre Hadot's work, that the understanding of ancient philosophy, the Neoplatonic Stoic traditions, the cultivation of wisdom. I'm saying too much. You go, you please.
Yeah, sure. So the book came out of this kind of like double insight at the same time. One was that the first half was that, hey, this is a philosophical project asking what is psychedelic experience.
Exactly.
But at the very same moment, in like the same kind of insight, I saw that the thing that was attracting me to these experiences was the same thing that was attracting me to philosophy.
I've had a similar experience.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I kind of want to hear about that, but let me finish this, and then I want to come back to that. So, so I had this this insight that there's something kind of intrinsically philosophical about the experience.
Yeah.
And I was having these experiences, and they were affecting my philosophy, and in a way that seemed to be doing better. Like I was writing journal articles that were, I think, objectively better. So my peers were telling me,
like, similar experiences.
Okay. Yeah. It's okay. I want, can you tell me a little bit more about?
Well, just a little. I'll just give you a quick thing, an example of this.
Sure.
So I had a version of the meaning crisis in high school when I went into University, and I took an introductory philosophy class, and I read The Republic, and I met Socrates and the Platonic framework, and it was like, this is what I'm looking for. Because I had come out of a fundamentalist Christian sort of framework, and right, the taste for transcendence was still in my mouth, but I had rejected that framework. And then I found, wait, here's a way of doing this that doesn't require me to sacrifice my rationality. It has genuine aspirational value and power. And I got really attracted to this. And then I went on in academic philosophy, and the topic of wisdom dropped off the table. Like this discipline that has wisdom in its very, and the love of wisdom in its name drops off the table. Now, I found an independent value for philosophy. One we're exemplifying right now, reflection, conceptual clarification, theoretical integration. These are all, and they helped me become a good cognitive scientist. So I don't regret it, but I was hungry for the cultivation of wisdom. So I went to a place down the road that taught Tai Chi and meditation. And I started doing Tai Chi and meditation, and especially initially the Tai Chi was, and what was happening, I was having, powerful flow experiences and deep, because I was doing this very religiously, 3 or 4 hours a day in total kind of thing, right? Going to the center multiple times a week. So I was aware of all these sort of phenomenological changes within the practice. You're doing Tai Chi, there's days where you're burning like you're in a furnace, and other days where you're cold like you're in ice, and all that sort of stuff. And thankfully, I had some traditional literature to point my say, don't freak out about any of this, just keep going, right? But then I was in graduate school at the time, and my friends came to me and they said, what's up with you? When you're in graduate school, you feel you're an imposter the whole time, right? And it's like, right? Right? And, oh no. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you're way different now. You're much more balanced and flexible in your thinking, resonate with people. And I realized, oh, the Tai Chi is somehow, permeating my life and percolating through my psyche in ways that I'm not aware of. And so it was satisfying that need for the cultivation of wisdom. Now, as I got along far enough, and cognitive science started to shift, and philosophy shifted towards the 4E cognitive science stuff, these topics of mindfulness and wisdom and insight and mystical experience became scientifically legitimate, and the two came back together for me.
Yeah, nice. It's so similar to the experiences I've had. I've had people come up to me who I hadn't seen for years, and I've had people say that I'm just happier and more relaxed and kinder. And then one friend of mine said, it's like I've been upgraded.
Exactly.
So and then I've had it's just so many. So it's interesting you mentioned Tai Chi, because one of the kind of really big insights that I had from myself personally was how important having a movement practice is.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I've been emphasizing that.
Yeah, and not just for health. It's often associated with health and well-being, but I think for philosophy.
Yes, exactly. For the cultivation of wisdom. Exactly. I've had some excellent discussions with Rafe Kelly around this. I gave a talk at the embodiment, or was it the Mindful Movement Symposium on this? Yeah, exactly. So let's get into this then. So let's be more specific, more zeroed in. How can psychedelic experience contribute to the cultivation of wisdom?
Yeah, so there's different ways of approaching this. One way is to think about what philosophers have said what wisdom is.
Yes.
Right, and then we could think about how psychedelics may contribute to those specific ideas about wisdom.
I was just going to say, it's not only philosophers these days. Cognitive scientists talk a lot, and the psychology.
Yeah, sure.
Very, very big, very, very, very hot topic right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then also, at a more kind of coarse grain level, you could think about it as at a very high level, what is wisdom? And it's got something to do with living well.
Yes.
Right. There's a lot to unpack there, right? But at a very high level, it's about living well. And so we could look at the empirical literature. Are people who are having these psychedelic experiences in the right context, of course, do they tend to live well afterwards? Is there an improvement in their well-being afterwards?
The answer is
yes. And the evidence seems pretty clear that there is this
yeah.
improvement. So there's that. And then so the question is then what's what's causing that. There's that correlation, but then what's the
exactly.
what's the underlying mechanism or process? So there's so one conception of wisdom that I really like. It's not the only one, but the one that's kind of probably my favorite is the Socratic one.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which can be kind of, I think it's more nuanced and subtle than how it's usually characterized. But like kind of very briefly, it's kind of being aware of your ignorance.
Yes.
Or not, or in a way like not being ignorant, because there's a way of understanding ignorance is it's not just knowing stuff, but it's also kind of deliberately avoiding what you don't know. And I think like, so there's a kind of, one way of thinking of that is we go around our lives with a kind of hidden uncertainty. We think we know things when we actually don't.
Yes.
And there's all sorts of processes that are causing that, but we're kind of confident in some kind of belief that we have. But deep down, we're actually uncertain about it. And one thing that meditation and psychedelics can do is they can bring that kind of uncertainty up to the surface.
Very much.
And you can realize, I mean, in the extreme cases, and you see this a lot in the literature and the reports, people say, I don't know anything, let alone a specific item. This kind of, go ahead.
I think you can see from some of my work, the Socratic tradition is just deeply important to me. And so, one of my favorite phrases is, wisdom begins in wonder, from Socrates. Where wonder isn't curiosity, it's more than what you're talking about here. And Fuller talks about that difference. Curiosity is, but wonder is this much more comprehensive. I don't know, but ultimately experienced in a positive framing, rather than in some sort of anxiety or crippling or traumatic fashion.
Yeah, more like fascination.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And so one thing that's worth mentioning is that this is one point where I was completely surprised by this. It dovetails with my previous area of research on probability, decision making, right? So one of I think probably the kind of most dominant and destructive cognitive bias we have is that of overconfidence.
Yeah.
And a lot of my work is on trying to figure out how to help people be less overconfident in their forecasts and decisions.
You see that in confirmation bias and things like that. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different biases and mechanisms that feed into this kind of overall bias of overconfidence. And I think meditation and psychedelics kind of differentially target those depending on the individual.
Oh, that's very interesting. But keep going on the central topic right now, wisdom.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's I'm just trying to remember now. So there's the Socratic one, which is you kind of have hidden uncertainty or lack of knowledge, and that's brought to the surface. There's the Aristotelian notion of phronesis, which is often translated as practical wisdom. It's pretty good, but not perfect. Interestingly, there's some people have argued for a translation. It's mindfulness.
Yes, and I'm more happy with that because it comes closer. That I think that practicality, especially in our culture, it has a connotation that's very opposite to what Aristotle's trying to point to.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's pretty close to mindfulness, but I think one component of phronesis that's missing from mindfulness is being experienced in life.
Yes.
So Aristotle's pretty clear about this, that you don't expect kind of young people to have phronesis. It's something that comes with age, and not just merely with age, but also kind of being like actively engaged in life and kind of experiencing all these different circumstances and learning in an optimal way to.
It's the research point. It's more correlated with what's called psychological richness than just age, right?
Yeah, exactly.
People are pursuing a life that's psychologically enriching is the degree to which they will cultivate phronesis. Yes. Yeah,
exactly. So with that qualification in place, I think it's very, very close to mindfulness.
Yeah.
And there's I mentioned this earlier. There's a lot to say about mindfulness, and I think one aspect of it is definitely being able to pay attention to the present moment and kind of see truly what's going on, and that's clearly an important part of phronesis. You need to be able to see what the situation is in order to know what about your experience you're going to bring to the situation.
But
There's
I would say that in addition to that enhanced awareness, Phronesis has an enhancement of another capacity I talk a lot about, which is relevance realization. Because Aristotle continually talks about being able to do what's appropriate in the situation, being able to fit your cognition and your behavior appropriately to the situation as the kind of the defining feature of Phronesis. It's that ability to sort of evolve your salience landscaping and your behavior to fit the situation really well. That I think it is where it goes beyond just sort of mindfulness.
Yeah, exactly. One somewhat puzzling kind of aspect about Phronesis and the surrounding literature is that on the one hand, it's clearly a kind of a perceptual faculty, but on the other hand, it's very clearly tied to deliberation as well.
Yes.
Right. And it's those two, I think it's those two things that are kind of at the same time. You have this perceptual faculty, but you also have enhanced deliberation, which I think comes through, so coming at this from the mindfulness angle, that comes through like an enhanced working memory capacity. Yes. So you're able to hold more of the situation in mind and more about different possible previous life lessons in mind, integrate these things in a deliberative fashion, but also in a way that allows insight to kind of shine through and bear on the situation.
Yes. I think that's good. I mean, Aristotle also has Sophia, and there's a relationship between Phronesis and Sophia in the cultivation of wisdom. But in between there's Plato, because I think Plato has an idea of wisdom as anagoge, right? The ascent and the return. And for me, that's also another important notion, because we mentioned it earlier, this capacity to get reciprocal opening going. Mm-hmm. And I've talked with Mark Lewis, who's got a theory of addiction as the opposite, reciprocal narrowing.
Right.
So you get more and more like what did you call it, psychocryptic, right?
Right.
The world is losing complexity and novelty. So eventually you get to the place where you can't be any other than you are, and the world can't be any other than that is, and so your behavior is completely compelled, and that's addiction. And then you can think of anagoge as the reciprocal opening. And for Plato, I think that's a model of also another a model of wisdom that I think is important, and it gets a dimension that the Socratic and the Aristotelian don't quite pick up on. And I think it would converge well with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Addiction is one form of psychocryptic experience, I think, or psychocryptic state. And the opposite of that obviously must be a psychedelic one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it's not the only form of that happening. Like I think one aspect of your work that I really liked was the kind of on the stuff on bullshit.
Yes.
And this is the kind of the part of the meaning crisis, right? So there's people will bullshit us, but we'll also bullshit ourselves.
Yeah.
You can understand that as this kind of attentional cycle that's spinning you into a psychocryptic state that you're losing yourself.
Yeah.
So that's not, you're not addicted to any, I mean, it's probably an addiction in some sense, but certainly not to any kind of substance in these bullshit cycles.
So if you want to continue with, you were canvassing some wisdom frameworks, and we sort of talked about three: Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian, and then because we want to setting up a framework and how psychedelic experience could contribute to the cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah, so there was one we didn't quite touch. We kind of touched on briefly was Sophia.
Yes,
which is kind of like knowledge, which you could kind of understand as like knowledge of kind of higher truths and like really kind of important grand truths.
It's perception of first principles kind of idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's these are not the only ways to think about wisdom, but I think that kind of we've got 3 or 4 kind of pretty dominant ways of thinking about wisdom. So then what I think about is like, okay, so what are the ways that psychedelic experiences might contribute to these?
Yes.
Right. So we saw with this Socratic one, you can have this revelation of ignorance. You can realize that you thought you knew something, but actually you don't know. You know jack all.
Yeah.
With the Aristotelian notion of phronesis, this form of wisdom. I'm kind of moving very quickly here, but given its striking similarity to mindfulness, you've now got a connection to psychedelic experience, and there's kind of 2 connections there One is that psychedelic trips, the evidence is pretty clear about this. Under the right circumstances, they tend to lead to long-term increases in mindfulness.
Yep, yep, yep.
And then something I argue for in the book is that psychedelic experiences are also kind of approximations of temporary increases in mindfulness.
Yes, I think that's
They're not,
by the way, that's a beautiful thesis.
oh, thanks. Yeah, so they're not quite, so mindfulness would be the best thing, but failing that, you can get different approximations. And I think that explains why psychedelic experiences have these profound impacts on well-being and wisdom.
Sorry, I want to interrupt just because I want to say something that really reinforces your point. So going back to this, and I won't say exactly when, but when I was really starting to do Tai Chi very powerfully, I did mushrooms, psilocybin, because I wanted to get a taste. I wanted to get a taste, like a touchstone taste. And I was, because I did Tai Chi while I was, while I was during the psychedelic experience. And what it did is when I came out of it, I got this sort of phenomenological touchstone that I could then use to improve my Tai Chi.
Yeah.
And get better and better. And then, of course, and as I've already mentioned, that wasn't just within the practice, that was percolating out through it's percolating through my psyche, permeating through my life. And so exactly that when I read that, I was like, yes, yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Properly frame that temporary expansion can give you an aspirational foretaste that you can then, right, can serve as a guide, as a guide for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned Tai Chi, because so I said already I had the insight about the movement practice.
Yeah.
But one way this came out was that during one of these experiences, I caught myself in the mirror doing, I don't know, it was Tai Chi or Qigong or something like this. And I never did anything like this in my life.
Yeah, I can believe it.
And I realized I was kind of thinking about some philosophical problem. I forget what it was, but I realized I was using those movements to think.
Yeah, very much.
And so that's something I really draw upon all the time now. Like, instead of just being hunched over my computer, kind of furiously reading or typing, I'll often use a movement practice to help me think about some issue.
Excellent. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to stay focused on you, but the convergence and resonance between our experience and our work is like really impressive. So you're building a very good argument, very carefully, about how psychedelic experience can contribute to these dimensions of wisdom. Please continue.
Yeah. So I guess it was that. So mindfulness with phronesis.
Yeah.
So you've got these long-term increases in mindfulness and these temporary increases in mindfulness, where you can kind of snap something up and record and keep it for later on.
Yeah.
So an example from my own life was I once had the insight that I have to let myself not know.
Yeah.
It was a big insight that kind of came through my body. And so I'm not in that state right now, but it's something I can hold on to and contemplate. And I know I get better at recognizing the kinds of circumstances where I need to kind of bring that to the foreground and kind of contemplate it and use it to guide whatever that I'm doing. So these are all, I think, there's particular ways of contributing to phronesis, a kind of a practical wisdom. And then another one is Sophia.
Yes.
And I think probably so there's a kind of, okay, so this is where things can potentially go off the rails.
Yeah.
Or go kind of more spiritual, mystical than a lot of my my philosopher colleagues would like. Yeah. So there's a kind of safe version of this and a more kind of a riskier version. So I'll do the safe version first, which is just that a lot of philosophical problems or even like scientific problems require insight.
Yeah.
So the big breakthroughs usually come by insight, not by this step-by-step analytical thinking.
Exactly.
So if we're really interested in Sophia, so this could be like mathematical knowledge or knowledge about physics or philosophy, ethics, whatever it is, however you want to understand that, but these kind of bigger topics, advancing our knowledge with respect to these things often involves insight, and psychedelics and meditation are like, this is the evidence is pretty clear that they promote insight. Yeah. So that's the safe version.
I've made similar arguments, similar based on similar sort of curation of the empirical evidence and the best theoretical arguments. And I think the evidence for these improving your capacity for systematic insight. So you're getting maybe something like more systemic insight within cognitive processes. So you're getting the capacity for more systematic insight, not just this problem, but what the insight machinery doesn't just solve problems. There's problem solving and there's problem finding. Insight machinery also says, here's a bunch of disconnected problems, and look, they're all one problem. And if you both problem find and then solve that problem with insight, that's a systematic insight. And that's often the kind of insights that you're referring to. And it's clear, I think, that in fact, the more powerful versions of these psychedelic experiences contribute greatly to people's capacity for systematic insight.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think there's kind of small insights. So certainly I've had insights where it's about I need to make a presentation to a company, and I need to like find some kind of cool way of presenting the material and given the time constraints and what I know about the audience. So that sort of stuff happens. But then you can also have these huge insights that are kind of not even propositional in form. They're more like a kind of a revelation of a perspective, a different way of looking at the world. I think it's also, you just reminded me that it's important to think again about the mechanisms behind these, because without those, this can kind of sound somewhat fanciful. I think what's going on behind the scenes of all this is just these disruptions to attention. Right. So you can't, I don't think you can just take psychedelics and have some profound insight on, say, quantum mechanics or something like that. You need to learn the thing that you're thinking about, the problem. You need to really, that needs like good high quality knowledge needs to go in. But then as in that process of doing that, you form these attentional habits, certain ways, you call them frames, these ways of framing problems, right? And meditation psychedelics make it easier to kind of break those frames or to switch frames and to see the problem from a different angle.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you very briefly, and I don't want to divert you for too long. And so some of the work I published, I made a distinction, between meditation and contemplation, where meditation tends to be a very frame-breaking kind of behavior, and as you say, controlled. Whereas contemplation, is much more of a frame-making behavior. I have to compare it to meditation is looking at your glasses and seeing if you need to clean them, right? And then contemplation is seeing if you can see anything new once you clean them. And you need both. Each one tells you if the other one is going well, right? So if I'm doing all this contemplation and I take off my glasses and everything's really smudged and dirty, I go, oh, my contemplative practices are going wonky, right? I think I've cleaned my glasses and I put them on and I can't see anything new. I don't get the new vision. Then maybe my meditation is just sort of, playing around and kind of mental masturbation kind of thing, right? And so I see that's why I think one of the, and this is part of the, and I know you're aware of this, the criticism of the West's appropriation or misappropriation of mindfulnesses and the reduction, right? If you look in most mindfulness traditions, there's a rich ecology of practices. There's meditative practices, there's movement practices, there's contemplative practices, there's social interaction, ethical practices, and all of these are constellated together. And so absolutely. I just wanted to expand what you meant by the machinery. The machinery is it's a very rich and dynamically self-organizing ecology. So I just wanted to just expand that point just a little bit, because I think it's an important point.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and kind of two things I want to throw in because I want to make sure we come back to them. I think there's also the Eightfold Path. So in the West, we tend to focus on the mindfulness, right? But I think we miss a lot by not focusing on the full Eightfold Path.
Exactly.
And then there's a question I had for you. I'm hoping we can get into it. Was that I really like this kind of two-dimensional space you've got of
dimensional scale.
What was it? It's transparency and opacity and features and
featural,
I really like that. And so the way you understand is meditation is this kind of scaling down of attention, and contemplation is a scaling up.
Yeah.
I was curious, so what about the other quadrants?
Yeah. And so me too. And whether or not I haven't been able to, I've talked to people and I played around with it. Part of it is just I have not put enough time into. Part of the reason, and it's not just laziness or busyness on my part. I can't find anything. So one of the methodological constraints, and I make it very clear, is I want to know the mindfulness practices that facilitate insight and flow. And those two quadrants, there's lots of literature in the insight literature that map onto those. I can't find anything in the insight literature that maps on to the other two. I looked and I haven't. Some people have suggested that might be a pathological dimension. I don't know. But so I mean, part of it was busyness, and part of it was so I was very concerned that the relationship between mindfulness and insight and mindfulness and flow, and I won't go into it, but I think of flow as an insight cascade, right? That was constantly being said both within the traditions and within the scientific literature, but nobody was trying to but why? And you didn't use it, but the traditional Kabat-Zinn definition of mindfulness provides no theoretical machinery to explain insight whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I was like, I admit that I became very focused on those dimensions of mindfulness that could help me explain insight and flow, and therefore possibly, as you're doing here, contribute to how can mindfulness belong to the cultivation of wisdom. And again, not the traditional, that's the wrong word, the sort of commonplace, even within psychology, the Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah.
Why should this contribute to wisdom at all? Right? So
in fairness to Kabat-Zinn, I think his focus was on, he was sort of a trailblazer, right? He was bringing mindfulness in. Yeah, it's a good technique for teaching it, I think.
Yeah, right. And I make that very clear. I mean, in the I don't know if I sent you this. I think you did. The thing I make a distinction between the language of training and the language of explaining.
Yeah.
What he's doing is train, but so my criticism isn't of him per se. My criticism is how his definition was taken up into academic psychology.
I completely agree. And so I had similar problems with both psychedelic experience and mindfulness. So if I looked at the standard definitions, they didn't give me anything to work with.
Yeah.
Like I didn't, because as an analytic philosopher, I need to break things down and then plug them into each other, and that's how you make progress.
Yeah, there's theoretical.
So I think the other quadrants, I think, like, you can get into those spaces, and they are connected to the things that we think about, right? So certainly I've used meditation to kind of take the step back to move to a more opaque mode to facilitate a gestalt shift.
Yes, you can bounce around like that too, and I want to admit that right up front. And one of the problems, it's always a problem when you're writing an article, right? You can come up with a static schema, and remember, it's not a graph; it's a schema. I try to convey that, right? The dynamic aspects of it are. I only focused on one dynamic relationship, which is the opponent processing. But I'm not claiming that that's the only dynamic going on with
that. I think you have a really nice point about these understanding mystical experiences as these two different kinds. I think so. One was the pure consciousness, and the other one was the kind of more unitive.
So the maximal scaling down will give you something like the pure consciousness event. The maximal scaling up will give you sort of resonant at 1 minute. And then there is a third state that's explicitly talked about in the literature, like prajna, in which you're doing this. And these are just gestural metaphors at best, but I strongly believe, with good reason, that I've experienced that right? Non-duality, I think, is it's the deepest and the farthest out. It's the grain of sand in the world. It's all of that. Yes, very much.
Yeah, me too. I think so. You must be familiar with Stace's work. He calls this the kind of vacuum and plenum understandings of mystical experience. And kind of the full thing is actually both
Yes,
at the same time.
very much, very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that. That was
Yeah, I have to say, I've really enjoyed. I've read a few of your papers now, and then I've been watching a bunch of your lecture series, and yeah, it's really awesome. It's
well, I'm having the same experience now with your work, so I just want to reciprocate. I think I want to know as soon as your book's out. I'm recommending it very strongly by this video. I want to recommend it to everybody. I think I'll be a little bit bold here. I think this is the book that people should read about psychedelic experience. There's a lot of other books out there, but I think this book is. I think your book is getting an. I'll use one of my terms from Model Ponzi. I think it's getting an optimal grip on the phenomenon.
Wow. Oh, thank you very much. It's yeah, I wrote it for, as I said, I wrote it kind of for my former self, the book I wish had existed when I first started having these experiences. There were lots of other books out there, but they didn't, it's not to say that they were wrong or anything, but they just didn't speak the language that I spoke back then.
And so
they
also didn't do the work that you're doing. Like this this double move of the philosophy of psychedelics and then a psychedelic philosophy. That is, as far as I can tell, unique and original to you, and it's valuable. It's important. So just to return us back, you had gone the non-risky Sophia cultivation aspect of psychedelia, and then we're going to get into the more risky. But we're already touching on it, the mystical, right?
Yeah.
A risky version of how psychedelic experiences can contribute to the cultivation of Sophia. So, what is that more risky version? Why is it more risky? But why is it potentially also more valuable, or at least has a kind of independent value from the previous one?
Yeah, that's also a great question about the value of these experiences. Yeah. So there's a few controversial points of the book, but I think probably the one that kind of rubs people the wrong way, to put it that way, well, scientists in particular, is that I think, let me see how to phrase it, that, okay, I'll do the weak version of it first, that there's, in order to, a very valuable way of understanding what mystical experiences are is in terms of their ineffability.
Yes.
We need to take their ineffability seriously as the kind of primary feature of these experiences. And one reason why I think this is for people like us, academics working in the West, we're hyper analytic.
Yeah, proposition.
Right? And we're kind of so theory driven, evidence driven, right? And it's our only way of understanding something is to be able to kind of write it out in propositional form and have an argument and evidence and to kind of articulate it in a way so that anyone can understand it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's obviously been a incredibly powerful form of understanding. We're doing it right now. Yeah. But I think mystical experiences are, I should be careful on how I articulate this. I think there's a valuable way of understanding mystical experiences such that there's singularities for that kind of understanding enterprise.
Right.
And one kind of a method for understanding these experiences, or kind of getting the understanding that they afford us, is by contemplating what that ineffability amounts to. And so this is the what I call in the book the no theory of mystical experience. So everyone wants to have a theory of mystical experience. So people say that it's an experience of unity, of oneness. Some people say that it's an experience of the illusion of the self. Some say it's pure consciousness. That there's different theories, and we have these psychometric scores, like we can measure like how much oceanic boundlessness you experience. And I think there's value there. I'm not saying like that don't do that at all, but it can only take us so far. Yeah, and so yeah, I don't know which. So there's a lot to launch into there. So
I want to respond to that.
Sure, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I think there's a profound thing in here. This is something. This is a more I wouldn't call this a cognitive scientific. This is more of a philosophical point I want, but I think it has bearing on what I'm seeing happening in forward cognitive science. So there was one of the differences sort of before, if you look at, I'm not saying this happened suddenly, but if you sort of look before the scientific revolution and then after, there is, what happens is a kind of fundamental change. And I've been talking to this recently with Greg Enriquez, a psychologist, Zachary Stein, also a psychologist. Here's the fundamental change. So the Neoplatonic Christian tradition, I'll just use the Western tradition, but I can point to analogous things in other traditions. But there's an idea that there are certain truths, there are certain dimensions in our ontology. There's a kind of ontological depth perception that is only available to us after we undergo significant transformation. That there are truths that will only be disclosed through transformation. And this isn't a really bizarre idea because we acknowledge this in terms of our development. There's truths that you can't get when you're a 5-year-old. You have to transform the machinery. It's not about getting different beliefs. You have to transform the functionality of the machinery in order for you to be able to see and realize. And I'm using a sort of Piagetian model here. By the way, that Piagetian stage change has been used by people talking about wisdom. As the child is to the adult is to the sage. And so what mystical experiences point to is that I think that there are truths that are only accessible, and not only more, but kinds of truths, more importantly, that are only accessible to us after transformation. Now, this goes against kind of like, the Cartesian and the Lockean proposal. No, you don't have to be personally involved. You just have to get the right method and get the right training and the right method. And that method is universal. And therefore it will give you access to everything you need. And you don't need any of this spirituality in order to get to the depths of reality. And I think what mystical experience does is it reminds us, our development isn't done. And there is a lot of reality that we're blind to because we have not gone through the requisite transformation. And then if you look at, even go into like hardline Chomskyan literature, transformations are not representations. They don't have representational content because they are not representations, they are transformations. And that's what I wanted to say about, so while they don't have content in themselves, I think there is a developmental, there's a developmental progress, and I hate to use the word progress, but there's a developmental progression that has ontological significance. That's what I wanted to say at that point. I don't know how that lands for you, but that's very much an argument I've been making.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it touches on one of the reasons why I like the ineffability idea, because I don't know what transformation you need to go through.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I could make some guesses, but there's a good chance I'm going to lead you astray. If I say mystical experience is about seeing the unity of everything, that may not be the thing that you need to hear.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. It's too much Sophia, not enough Phronesis.
Exactly. Yeah. Or so there's some. I try not to get irritated about this stuff, but the people going around saying like there's no self and saying that you have to realize there's no self as a kind of metaphysical statement. I think like that can be a useful pedagogical tool for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I think for other people, it can do more harm than good. Maybe what they need to hear is say that the Atman is Brahman message.
Yeah.
Instead, right?
I agree, and I think there's also, I have a whole series out there, The Elusive Eye, with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro, trying to get the best philosophical reflection, cognitive science, developmental psychology, and one of the things I would say, just like attention and psychedelic experience, when people talk about the no self, they think they're saying something very specific, but it is massively equivocal. Are they talking about phenomenological aspects of narrative ego? Are they talking about a unified functionality of agency? Those aren't the same meaning for the word self. Which are you talking about? And just conflating them together is so I hope you don't mean that no self means I lose my agency. It's clearly not what the Buddha was talking about. He talks about freedom.
The opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The enhancement of agency. So what do you
Yeah.
mean? So yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, yeah, I really like that argument you made about, I don't know if you're familiar with John Wright's notion of sensibility transcendence, where he talks about the fact, he uses an example from Iris Murdoch about a mother-in-law who doesn't like her daughter-in-law. She sees her daughter-in-law as sort of coarse and impetuous. And then she realizes she doesn't have just an insight into her daughter-in-law. She has an insight into like how she's been framing her daughter-in-law, right? She gets more of a systematic insight. And she realizes, no, she's been to tunnel vision. And the daughter-in-law is actually, she's really creative and she's grounded and she's wonderfully present. And Wright talks about that as sensibility transcendence, where you realize that you've had these categorical meanings of these terms and you need to break them so that you can fit the sort of suchness of that particular person better. And I think that you're bringing in that, in addition to whatever sort of, well, I don't know what to call it, ontological view from above, Nagel kind of transcendence, people also need sensibility transcendence in the cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah. And the only way to really, I mean, you can get some kind of outside guidance on that, but really the only way to do it is to go within, or to have that internal transformation.
Well, it's very much like therapy, right? And I'm not saying it's therapeutic. I want to be clear about that, but I'm saying it's very much like therapy. You have these general techniques, right? It's or like the law. You have these general techniques, but you have to have a human being in there, right, that fits into the particular, right, the particular developmental transformational course that the person's on. I think that's an excellent, by the way. And I put together the value of ineffability as keeping an unanalyzable space for that idiosyncratic specificity of transcendence. I think that's a beautiful point, Aidan. I think that's a beautiful point.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, like another way, the flip side of it is also epistemic humility.
Yes, of course.
Like just so this comes back to the Socratic thing, like realizing what you don't know. So I'm not in a, like I might have had these amazing experiences and interpret them in a particular way, but I don't know like what it is for you, or I don't know what the best thing I could say to you to get you there, unless I've spent a lot of time with you and I'm like highly empathetic and we're kind of in alignment. And this is what you see, I think, with Zen teachers and their students. You have that work being done where the master is understanding the student and like learning what is blocking their progress. And then you can, and they often don't make a propositional statement, right? They be presented with a koan or something like this, and right. So
this reminds me of what Aristotle said, about wisdom. And he picks up on Plato, like, the way the virtues are not, the virtues can't be reduced to rules. Doesn't mean we don't use rules to cultivate virtue. But be kind. That's a good rule, but that doesn't mean what does it mean to be kind to my daughter? What does it mean to be kind to my lover? What does it mean to be kind to a stranger? Those aren't the same things, right? And then, but also going backwards, what it means for John to be kind is different from what it means for you to be kind, which is just like, what it means for Peter to be strong is different from what it means for Tom to be strong. And like, all of that fittedness. I think that's really important. I think that's exactly right. And putting the two together, the way the sensibility transcendence outward and the epistemic humility inward, I think that's really good. Really good. And I like the idea. I really like the idea of ineffability as being like, don't tread on me, kind of. This is a space that you need to keep open so that we'll constantly be recognizing the need for sensibility, transcendence, and epistemic humility. I think that's really good.
Oh, thanks. This also, I want to add, there's a kind of technical problem that arose out of this thinking that I'm still very much puzzled by, which is the connection between ineffability and uncertainty and complexity. And then also, how is this going to, like, what is this going to look like in a kind of scientific worldview? Right. So suppose we like genuinely take this ineffability of the experience to be completely serious. Then there's a question like, how does that line up with the scientific analysis of these experiences? Because we can still scan people's brains while they're having these experiences, right? We can measure everything.
Yeah, we've been talking about. We can talk about, like you said, we should not. You're not saying don't talk about the phenomenology. You're not saying don't talk about the functionality. You're not saying that. That you explicitly say that. And yes, I take it the difficulty doesn't lie in that we can do the scientific, or at least the philosophical reflection on the phenomenology. We can do the scientific investigation of the functionality, etc. Because we do want to understand how these experiences contribute in general to wisdom, right? So there is some functionality we're trying to get at, and I take it you don't think that those are not available to scientific theorization. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I'm still kind of thinking this through, actually. So yeah, so I think so remember I said there was a psychedelic space, and the deeper you go into it, the more you approach it a mystical experience.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the experiences that we say are mystical are not to denigrate them in any way, but they're not like at that absolute maximum point. There's a lot of ego dissolution, sense of timelessness, all that sort of stuff can happen kind of along the way. And I think we can talk a lot about all of that stuff. Like I could talk about ego dissolution and dissolving of subject-object distinction. And then I can also look at like potential neurocorrelates of that, right? So maybe this orthogonality between the default mode network and the task positive networks, that's been a candidate. So we see that dissolve, and that seems to line up with the dissolving of the distinction. I'm not saying that's true, but like it's completely plausible that we would find things like that.
By plausible, you mean it seems like we're making we're doing the kind of science that we do elsewhere. We're gathering good empirical evidence. We're making good theoretical argumentation. Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's also the possibility that you can then say, and doing this might improve these other functions because of that happening. Okay, great. Keep going.
Yeah, exactly. So open to all of that. But then there's, and maybe this is not like ever realized in actuality, but there's an ideal limit, like the maximum of clarity, scope, duration, and novelty, the full-blown mystical experience. And now, let's suppose for the moment that point is actual, like that some people actually have it. It's not just approximations to it, that actually happens. And it's intrinsically ineffable. So we can't say what it is. We can't even say that we can't say what it is, right? There's this paradoxicality of ineffability. Okay, so we have these mental states like that, right? How do we study them? So we need, in terms of from a scientific perspective, so we could have the kind of brain scans as neurological evidence, and with some bridge principles that would connect the two, right? So like with the correlates between the default mode network and the task positive networks and ego dissolution, we're studying something at the neurological level, and we have a bridge principle that connects that to the mental level. Suppose we had the bridge principle, and we had as much neuroscientific evidence as we could possibly want. Wouldn't we get a
dimension though? You can also study them developmentally. You can study people, what's their functionality like on various measures, cognitive, affect, existential, before and after, and you can see the difference. That do an intervention study, which is, well, how does it reliably transform? And if you get science on that and you say, look, there's this reliable transformative thing that happens across this state developmentally. I think you can also do that. I don't see why you couldn't do that scientifically as well.
Yeah, nice. Completely agree. So suppose we have all of that. We have a puzzle though. So if the mental state is genuinely ineffable, one way to frame it is, what is the neural correlate of ineffability? Right. And so there's a kind of a skeptical response to this question, which is that you can imagine like somehow like let's say like language centers of the brain are knocked out, and so people just can't speak anymore or whatever, right? So that's why these experiences are seen as ineffable. But another kind of non-skeptical sort of way of understanding what the correlate might be might be that it's also ineffable at the scientific level as well. So what would that amount to, right? Like what, because that seems like quite a strange thing. Is it like I use the term singularity, so you could think like, are we going to see like black holes in the human brain? Yeah, that's unlikely, or some weird quantum effect. I wouldn't want to like hang my theory on those ideas. But I think maybe like, and this is, I'm not committed to this at all, but this is something an idea I've been playing around with. Ineffability at the physical level is like, it's an indescribability. And description in science and philosophy is compression.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You have some observations and you're compressing the data.
Very
right?
much.
And so indescribability would be incompressibility. And so what would incompressibility look like? It would be a kind of explosion in complexity and no discernible patterns in these states. And so this is something I'm not committed to it, but it's something I'm curious to see if we end up seeing something like this happen. We already are seeing there's this kind of complexification of the brain state in psychedelic states.
I was going to say that the kind of developmental evidence and the neurological is you're getting complexification, especially developmental. And then there's a conformity theory, like the Platonic, Aristotelian, Neoplatonic theory, that there's a kind of knowing that isn't about having description, it's about conforming, so that I get a complexity in my brain. It's actually my brain in between the brain and the world that couples to, and that's why you have a lot of sexual metaphors, I would say, for this, right? It couples to the complexity of the world. But if that's the case, there's a sense in which, and I'm not trying to trespass on what you just said, but there's a sense in which, it does fit into the developmental trajectory. Because one way of understanding development is complexifying your brain so that it couples to the complexity of the world. So you get better and better at staying, continuity of contact with reality, if you'll allow me that way. And so I think the idea that you're getting a kind of explosion in, I'm glad you said complexity, because when I first was thinking about, I thought you were saying sort of noise, and I don't think that's right, because
no,
the idea
that's describable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's because it also, there's enough of the phenomenology that people are, there's something that's supra-intelligible, not sub-intelligible going on. That seems to be, as far as I can tell, very universal. And this idea of a complexity that somehow couples to you, but that you can't compress into any kind of knowledge format. I don't think that's a, I mean, I think that's, I don't think it's an implausible idea. I think more argument needs to go into to make it a plausible idea, but I think, I'll put it this way, and I mean this as a compliment. I think it has prima facie plausibility.
Yeah, I think so too. Or at least I like puzzles, and this was a puzzle that I was led to, and this would be an intriguing way of solving the puzzle.
What I'm trying to say is I've come to something very similar about, you get to this complexification that can't compress itself, but it's something you are. It's not something you have or can speak. And this is, again, kind of a report, right? It's that you get a complexity, right, that couples to the world. And you have analogs, and I mean this weekly, but you have Uraro's work that one of the points of narrative isn't its content. It's that narrative puts our cognition into a kind of a form of dynamical complexity that tracks dynamical systems in the world well. So when you start to think narratively, you turn your brain processing into more of a dynamical system, right? Across time and across, think about plot and character, like you're doing, and what you're doing is setting yourself for tracking conflict. It's very good for tracking people, is their basic argument. Regardless of the content of the narrative itself helps you conform to the dynamical complexity of persons. So I'm not saying that's the same thing, but I'm saying it's in that you can see that kind of thing. And people often have a sense, you can see this, that it's just the narrative itself that is somehow valuable. That's me trying to say, I've been thinking something very similar and convergent, but I'm also hesitant like you. So I was also talking to myself when I said it has sort of a prima facie.
Yeah, it's it's a kind of it's a little bit of an out there idea. So that's why I'm a little bit cautious about it. But I think you see this in, like, when you look at the reports of mystical experiences, they often bifurcate. You see people saying the exact opposite thing.
I've pointed that out multiple times. I pointed that out in some of the work I've done. That when people come out, like there's it's Taylor's book. I can't remember the title. I was reading these two reports side by side. One person goes in and they come out and said, "Now I know there's a God." Another person comes in and comes out and says, "Now I know there's no God." And they're both joyful. Right. They're both happy. They're both becoming wiser. And I was like, yeah, that's really, really, I thought that was really, really important.
Yeah. And you see this with the dominant theories as well. So with the kind of perennialism and contextualism.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So a lot of people have the idea there's a common core to all these experiences. People say, no, they're highly contextual and kind of constructed from your context, your beliefs and whatever. And so I think as we get more precise at measuring, so like, especially using, I say, these micro-phenomenological techniques, so you're getting more precise measurements at the phenomenological level, and we get better at measuring it at the brain level. I think what we might find is that there's just so much complexity. There's no, beyond saying there's a complexification and talking around the experience, like approximations to it, there's nothing that we can say scientifically that would speak to the kind of what the experience is.
And this is only meant as an analogy. It might be that it's like the weather, and we can have meteorology, but we can't get a meteorology that gives us the kind of predictive success we have in other sciences. I think that's highly plausible. I think that's highly plausible.
Yeah.
We're getting to the end of our time. We covered everything I wanted to talk about pretty much. I hope you feel that you got to present your ideas as clearly and comprehensively as you could. Give me some links for this video so that I can help promote your work, especially
thanks.
Psychedelic Experience. No, I want to. I think it's important work. I want people to engage with you. I would like to set up a meeting between you and one of my favorite dialogical partners, Evie Slavin, the Seekers of Unity, who does some of the best work on mysticism. And he and I have had you might want to watch them, had a great series of dialogues about this, the cognitive science and mysticism. It'd be great if you two talked at some time. I'd like to give my guests any final summative or cumulative thing you want to say about our discussion today.
I mean, we could talk about this forever. So I think we had a pretty good. This conversation was a pretty good optimal grip on the on the topic. If people want to, so the book is not out yet. It's still going through the publication process. So if people want to find out about the book, they can just go to my website. It's aidanlyon.com. It's just my full name.com. And then there's a place where you can sign up for the email newsletter and find out when it comes out.
Great. Well, Aidan, I hope we talk again. And I wanted to
thank you. Me too.
It's wonderful. Yeah, maybe now that we've got more of an explication and explanation of your work, we could have a discussion about points of convergence and maybe points of divergence between your work and mine. I find that very
I would. Given that we agree on so much, I think like we really came at this topic like independently, like from different perspectives, obviously touching points on some of the same literature, but really came to a lot of the same ideas in an independent way. And so I really want to find out where we disagree, because that's where we're going to learn.
Exactly. Well, we'll set up another discussion.
Sounds good.
The disclosure of disagreement, we'll call it. Okay.
Very cool.
Take good care.
Thanks.